I'm going to begin by greeting everyone. I want to greet all of our listeners and thank you very much for joining us for this very important discussion of the University of California's implementation of a new undergraduate admissions policy which removes standardized tests, the SAT or ACT, as an application requirement. We're going to hear today from 4 senior officials at the university who are responsible for both development and implementation of this new admissions policy. Our speakers are Yvette Gulat, who's going to moderate the session. Yvette at the UC Office of the President is Vice President for Graduate and Undergraduate Affairs, Vice Provost for Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion, and the system-wide Chief Diversity Officer. Thank you, Yvette. We will also hear from the Chief Faculty Senate Officer, who's responsible for UC undergraduate admissions, the chairperson of the Board of Admissions and Relations with Schools, that is Madeline Sorapur, faculty member who teaches new media and digital composing at the University of California, Santa Barbara. The University of California System-Wide Director of Undergraduate Admissions, Han Mi-Yoon Woo, will also speak. And then finally, we're going to hear about this new admissions policy, about its implementation, quite significantly, from Gary Clark, who is Director of Undergraduate Admissions at UCLA, the campus that receives the very highest number of applications of any single university campus in the entire United States. If we study the history of admissions at the University of California, since it was founded in 1868, we see some very interesting evolution, and it seems to be reflective when you look at the changes of the size of the state population and of its demographic makeup. Admissions in the early years was guided by the principle in writing that selection of students and the granting of scholarships should ensure geographic representation of all parts of the state. And it had to be absolutely free by legislation that there be no secular or political influence in admitting students. Well, then applications grew over the years, and in 1960, when those numbers had really become large, the California Master Plan for Higher Education was passed. It established 3 different admissions pools for the 3 major public higher education divisions in California: community colleges, the California State University, and the University of California. And UC's section was directed to select from among the top 1/8 of the California high school graduating class. And it required also enrollment of college transfers, a proportion at the upper division level. High school coursework and GPA were the elements that determined freshman admission during that period to UC campuses. But then, as selectivity at some UC campuses grew, then in 1968, 8 years after the master plan, standardized tests were adopted as an application requirement at UC because of concerns regarding grade inflation and differences in the curriculum of individual high schools. Now, without those tests, major features of UC admissions remain high school coursework and GPA, and they are within structures called holistic admissions and eligibility in the local context. Information on personal qualities will also be considered, and those are gained, the knowledge of that will be gained through the applicant essays, where students can communicate their strengths, such as leadership experience, possible creativity, high-level skills or interests in certain academic areas, a whole series of virtues. Now, with that, I'm going to turn to Yvette and ask, let's begin. Oh, I want to mention first that many of you listeners have submitted questions for the panel, and you also can submit additional questions via the YouTube chat function. Now, I'm turning to Yvette. George, did you have anything to say before Yvette begins? No. All right. Yvette, please, Ms.
Thank you.
Dr. Moderator.
Thank you, Margaret, for that introduction. And thank you to everyone who has joined us today for this conversation. And a special thanks to the Center for Studies in Higher Education at Berkeley for the opportunity to talk about this really important topic. What we're going to do this morning is have a conversation. We're going to, we have a set of prepared questions that we're going to be responding to. And we also have the questions that you submitted in advance. And we're going to get to as many questions as we can that you put in the chat. So I'd like to actually begin with Madeline as our chair of BORS and to ask her to set the context for us. How did the faculty approach this question of standardized tests and admissions? And why was it important to consider the role of tests right now?
Thank you, Yvette. And thanks for that question. And thanks very much for the opportunity to discuss what's going on now in admissions at the University of California. As we all know, the elimination of standardized tests as a factor in UC admissions has been much discussed with lots of editorials and commentary in the news and on social media. And that's because it's important and has repercussions not just for UC and our students, but also for other colleges and universities and the students who they serve. So regarding the question of how faculty approach standardized tests in admissions, I had a kind of front row seat on the, as a member of BORS, which is the Faculty Admissions Committee in 2019-2020, when the Standardized Testing Task Force did its work studying this question. And it was very much an approach driven by research and by evidence, with faculty on the task force who brought deep expertise from their own research and who devoted considerable time and effort to studying this issue. As you know, the Faculty Task Force recommended keeping the SAT and ACT as part of the admissions process, although there was a dissenting, some members dissented from that. And then President Napolitano and ultimately the regents decided to discontinue the use of SAT and ACT to explore other possibilities. And now most recently to discontinue using standardized tests altogether in admissions. I was also a co-chair of the faculty committee that was convened this past summer to study the possibility of using smarter balanced assessments in the admissions process as a kind of alternative to the SAT and ACT that was perhaps better integrated with high school curricula and that had the advantage of being already required and administered to all 11th grade students in California public high schools. So our working group met over the summer multiple times, looked at lots of data, and ultimately determined that the data showed that using smarter balanced assessments in admissions would only add modest incremental value in predicting student success and would likely come at the same cost as SAT and ACT tests do in terms of reproducing specifically racial and socioeconomic inequities. We also saw problems with converting what is a low stakes test meant to measure school accountability into a high stakes test meant to measure kind of individual achievement in the context of admissions. So ultimately we determined that it would not be wise to use smarter balanced assessments in admissions either. And overall, I think the whole process of revisiting standardized testing over these past few years underscores the complexity of admissions and the challenges of making admissions decisions in the context of the inequities that everyone knows exist in California K through 12 systems and throughout the country as well. So we want to make sure that we're on the right side wherever possible in terms of advancing equity and advancing access for students. And that's really kind of been the fundamental goal and a kind of guiding value, let's say, of all these faculty committees that have been convened to study the issue.
Thank you, Madeline. Now I'd like to turn to Hanmi Yunwoo. So Hanmi, you have the daunting task of ensuring implementation of policy, admissions policy across the system. So after this removal of standardized tests, what factors remain for consideration as part of UC's comprehensive review? Margaret talked about a few of them, but perhaps you can give us some greater insight into how those factors are used.
Sure. So thank you for the question. for folks who may not be as familiar with University of California's admissions policy, it's called comprehensive review. And what that means is it's allowing for campuses to select among the eligible students using multiple measures of achievement. And so this was approved more than 20 years ago by the Academic Senate and the UC Regents, and they approved over a dozen criteria, 14 to be exact, that could be used to consider when reviewing freshman applications. So some were academic in nature, like the strength of the academic preparation, and others non-academic, like achievements in the arts or community service and leadership. And the policy was designed to allow for multiple measures of achievement, like I said. And we also recognize that in California and across the state, across the country, students have disparate access to opportunities, both personally and academically. So all these achievements have to be viewed in the context of the opportunities that were available to them and their demonstrated capacity to contribute to the intellectual life of UC. So with the removal of standardized tests as one of the criteria, we went from 14 criteria to 13. So it's not monumental in terms of how the campuses are looking at the students and the applicants and their achievements. We're still very interested in the quality of the senior year program, looking for outstanding work on special projects, of course, the grade point average in the college preparatory courses and things like that.
Thank you, Hanmi. And then next for Gary, who's on the ground making these decisions on a daily basis during the admissions cycle. As the campus that receives the most applications for UC across the country, what are some of the changes you've had to make in the process itself in terms of how you review the applications and how you make decisions?
Yeah, I mean, there's certainly a number of ways I think I could address that, some of which are around the decision regarding standardized testing, others of which really come from the impact of the pandemic on students and their access to opportunities outside of class and, the transitioning to online classes in their school settings and all the challenges, changes, and pivot, which seems like you have to have an obligatory mention of the word pivot in any presentation that involves discussion around COVID or the pandemic. So the changes, I think, building a little bit on what Hanmi said, aren't as dramatic as the public might think at times. I think the presumption around college admission, I think generally in the public, is that it's GPA plus SAT equals you're in or you're not. Like these are the two great pillars of college admission, and if you pull one of those away, how are colleges and universities going to adapt to such a dramatic change? And as you heard Hanmi mention, that's not really the case with us. We have comprehensive review, which has 13 elements now that are still viable for us to consider and very informative in us making informed decisions about students' ability to be successful on our campuses and contribute both in and outside of the classroom. So the removal of one of those, I think, takes on this perception of being grander than it really was. Now, certainly it's a change, and this meant we had to really adapt our process to pull the presentation of test scores out of the review or admission consideration process. But based on the fact that we've been doing holistic admission for as long as we have, I'd like to think we've gotten pretty good at this, and we really do look to the whole application to tell the student story, to look at, rigor of high school program, to look at academic performance, to look at leadership and accomplishments outside of class, to get to know the student and their situation and circumstances based on what they share in their personal insight questions. So I think we felt very comfortable transitioning away from having standardized testing, which often really just played a complementary role to the other evidence we were seeing in the application, not the driving force that I think a lot of people perceive standardized testing to be in college admissions generally.
Thank you. You've spoken, Gary, a little bit to this a perennial question we hear, which is that when you remove one element, it puts additional pressure on the others. And what you're suggesting is that's actually not the case. And this next question is for Madeline to dig a little deeper into that. How are the faculty thinking about how to make sure that we have equity for all students, given that schools are differently resourced and access isn't the same for all? So, a grade in one school isn't the same as a grade in another, for example. Are the faculty thinking about how this change, even if it doesn't put pressure on other parts of the application, actually does, however, have some implications for future equity and access?
Yeah, thanks. I'm going to echo what Gary and also Han-Mi have said about kind of the importance of context. I think that's always been a crucial aspect of the way that admissions, the way that applications are reviewed at UC campuses, and that hasn't changed at all. And I think Han-Mi mentioned the 13 remaining factors for comprehensive review, and several of those explicitly mentioned context as a really important element. The eligibility in local context program that's been ongoing at the UC system for a good number of years now is, I think, a really important program, really important element of admissions in the sense that that really explicitly looks at students and their achievements in the context of what opportunities they have, what's available to them and how well have they done given the kind of the programs, given the resources that their high school has and so on. And so I think we're continuing to look at eligibility in local context as a really important factor that helps. I think someone at a meeting I heard said it creates a wider door for admissions. It really kind of helps broaden access to students who've done really, really well in really challenging situations. So high achieving students in low resource situations, I think that's a really important component of continuing to center equity in admissions decisions. I also think we have kind of ongoing initiatives that will maybe assume kind of more prominence now, or they're just are kind of already sort of doing the work and may kind of take on greater, I don't know, weight now or whatever, be put more in the spotlight. And I'm thinking not only of the eligibility in local context program, but also of our efforts to help high schools with A through G courses. So those are the courses that students are required to take to be eligible, entitled to review, to have their applications entitled to review at campuses. And so high schools offer these A through G courses, and some high schools offer few of them or aren't able to offer a full complement of A through G courses. And so one of the options that we're thinking about is offering some of those courses online so that students have access to the full complement of A through G courses and can kind of even if in their particular local context those courses aren't available to them. And then I also wanted to mention at the end of our Smarter Balanced assessment report, the committee really felt strongly about advancing some recommendations. And many of those are about, kind of maintaining and increasing equity in our admissions practices. And specifically, finding ways to do outreach to continue doing outreach to K through 12 schools. That's a feature, I think, on every campus, programs where faculty and graduate students and so on do outreach to schools, particularly lower resource schools, to make sure that students are getting, kind of the information they need about how to apply, and also, kind of just being available to answer questions and so on. So I think that outreach maybe becomes more important now, but I think basically, there are ongoing efforts that we just want to sort of continue to pay attention to as we think about equity and access in admissions.
Thank you, Madeline. I want to make sure that we have a common understanding of some of these admissions pathways. So would either Han-Mi or Madeline be willing to define ELC and eligibility in local context, because it's an important pathway that might be understood as a viable means to the university. So anyone who's wants to take a stab at the definition.
So
I defer to Han-Mi.
Okay. So for UC admissions, for first year admissions, we have a minimum set of criteria. We want students to take a defined set of at least 15 college prep courses. Within California, we refer to them as the A through G courses. And in those courses, we expect the students to have a minimum GPA of a 3.0. And then for the highest achieving students in the state, we have, and if they're not offered admission to the campuses they apply to, they are still guaranteed admission to the system, as Margaret mentioned in her opening comments, under the master plan for higher education in California. So we have sort of two pools of students, and there's great overlap amongst these students. We have what's called being eligible statewide, and we identify the top 9% of students in the state without using test scores. It's a sliding scale based on high school GPA plus the number of A through G courses, and you can find that on our website. And if you meet those criteria on the scale, then you would be considered statewide eligible. And then eligible in the local context is it extends the guarantee of admission to the UC system to the top 9% of students within each participating high school, participating in the ELC program. And so again, just like its title, it's within the local context of the high school. And it continues to be determined by GPA alone. And so it was unaffected by the test-free policy, but it's meant to increase eligibility across the state and in every high school in the state.
Great, thank you. So then, Hamid, staying with you, what has been the response of families and students and schools to the changes?
The response has been overwhelmingly positive. I think that we can see that just in evidenced by the increase in applications that we received last fall. I think there's a lot of clarity in UC being test-free versus test-optional. It takes a lot of the test prep stress off of students, but again, we know that students are applying to schools outside of the University of California system where they still may be preparing for taking the standardized test. And recently, we've been getting a lot of questions from counselors and from parents and families asking, I think that there's still some lingering doubt over whether or not we're truly test-free or not, because we do still ask for the information on the application. It's not a requirement, of course, but if a student has test scores, there's a space for them to enter it. And the reason we have that is that the test scores currently can still be used to fulfill the English subject area requirement for freshman admission, or to demonstrate English language proficiency for students who attend schools where the instruction is not in English. And also we have what's called the UC entry-level writing requirement. And test scores, there's a test score threshold which can be used to help students meet that requirement upon enrollment and help them in, help the campuses in placing them into their first year writing course. But these are all behind the scene processes, and the test scores are not sent to the campuses until after admission decisions have been released. And so readers don't have access to them. So even though we have it on the application, campuses do not have access to the test scores. But so just, I had to get that out there that, we are test-free. Test-free means test-free. And that's, again, I think we've had a very, very positive response to this.
Let me continue on this thread around tests in general, about increases in placement tests or other things. So are we seeing any evidence of an increase in those placement tests, like the analytical writing placement test or other courses that are used as a substitute for standardized test scores? I think you've answered it, that all of that information is behind the scenes, so one can't substitute for another. But could you clarify the role of those placement tests with respect to admission? And then comment, if you could, if it is a fair and equitable outcome for especially students from underrepresented groups to utilize these placement tests in that way.
I think I can address placement tests, especially writing placement tests, but they really aren't involved in the admissions process at all. I mean, these would be students placed in a writing course, in their first writing course, after having enrolled at a specific campus. So that's a different stage of the process for sure. But I'm actually really excited about the opportunity to do a different kind of writing placement now that we have many fewer students So we had previously, sorry to back up. So the entry-level writing requirement that Hanmi mentioned earlier is a UC system-wide requirement, and students can satisfy that still with AP scores, with a community college class. They can still satisfy that with SAT score if they submit an SAT score above, I think it's 680. But we are now in the process of discontinuing a system-wide test called the analytical writing placement exam, which again would place students once they're enrolled in a specific campus in a specific writing course. And so what's happening, it's actually really exciting for me as a person as a writing instructor, is campuses are developing their own writing placement processes. And I can speak to the one at UC Santa Barbara, but we've also been working with colleagues at Santa Cruz, Davis, Irvine, and a couple of other campuses who are doing this as well. And what we're doing is we're kind of rethinking writing placement in a way that converts it into kind of a learning opportunity, a teaching opportunity for students. We're trying to let students know what options they have. So what at each camp, at a specific campus that they're enrolled in, what might their first writing course be? And it's different at all the campuses, so it makes sense to have this be a campus-specific kind of program. So at UC Santa Barbara, there's really a choice of 2 courses that students can be placed in. And in our placement program, which we've developed, kind of COVID kind of pushed us to move a little more quickly with it, but we have it kind of up and running, and we've been doing it for a year and a half now. We tell students about these courses. Well, here's what this one course is like. Here's what you'll learn here. Here's what the assignments are like. Here's what the readings are like. And we tell them about the other course as well. And then we ask students to do some reflection on themselves as writers, their previous experience in high school courses with writing. And we ask them, what course do you think would be the most appropriate first writing course for you to take? And we try as much as we can to honor the student's choice. If we see indicators that maybe they would be better placed in a different course, then we, kind of reserve the right to do that and kind of guide them toward the course that we think is going to be most effective for them. But your question, Yvette, you mentioned, are these fair and equitable placement processes? And I think that's really what's guiding us here. Is we really want students to be informed, to know what they're about to, kind of enter into, the kind of college level writing that they're going to be doing, and to kind of empower them to think about what's best for them, to reflect on their own skills and their own strategies, their own goals as college students, and to participate in making the choice of their placement. And so I think it's been nothing but good, really, and I'm excited to see how these placements evolve. Now, this is just the one placement for writing. I think there are other placements as well. And again, not associated with admissions, but post-admissions. But it's just super interesting for us as teachers to read what the students are telling us about their high school experience, about what they want out of a college writing course, about how they're going to approach their learning. And anyway, I could go on and on about this, but I think it's been a really great outcome, actually.
And as you were speaking, I was thinking about your earlier reference to creating a wider door. It sounds like that this test-free environment might actually create a wider door in other aspects of student enrollment, not just admission. So thank you for that.
Yeah, absolutely. And also just kind of informing students, it's not about taking a test and you pass or fail and therefore you're here. It's about saying, well, here's what your options are. Here's what you're about to, encounter. And that's helpful information, especially for students who may not have that information previously or may not be as well prepared for college as others.
So Gary, thinking about the future student, right, who we're recruiting in the future, how has this impacted your recruitment strategies, particularly those for high achieving students from underrepresented groups? And are you doing anything different in your recruitment as a result of the university being test-free?
Not really. I think our efforts around recruitment, especially in kind of high achieving underrepresented student groups, we're really focused in other areas. I think our goal has always been to kind of meet students where they are, and whether that's virtually or in person, we're trying to identify where students are throughout the state and how do we engage with them, whether that's through interactions at the high school and visits to high schools, whether that's through relationships with community-based organizations or faith-based communities. I think our goal, in admission offices and extending to like early academic outreach and some of the other offices throughout UC that really support recruitment of underrepresented students, especially those kinds of partnerships and that kind of real community grassroots kind of presence and recruitment is what's always really yielded the best results. I think, students, for especially like first generation students who, for whom college going is not a foregone conclusion, what they know about UC might be limited, and their ability to picture themselves at UC might be challenging based on the limited information that they have. So how do we get in front of students and those who influence students to really break that image, to help them see themselves on our campuses and in our community? So the outreach around that has really been, through those organizations. The Office of the President has created a number of programs that I think campuses participate in to engage with students, to engage with counselors, to engage with community-based organizations, to find opportunities to bring families into the fold, because we know how important families can be in influencing this as well. And I think what I've really noticed is that, the removal of standardized testing, if ever we wondered if it was a barrier to students applying, I think we see the evidence that suggests that it was, because we've seen high achieving students applying to the University of California as measured by GPA at increasingly high rates that maybe weren't applying in the past. And this is anecdotal and I'm surmising this, but those students maybe weren't applying in as high a rate in the past. And it could have been because that test score might have scared them off. So I think as word gets out and as it becomes much more the norm and deeply understood that UC is test free, that student who had a hard time picturing themselves at UC, taking away that SAT or ACT scary part of the application for many students might help them to say, I'm a good student. I don't have to worry about this test score now. So yeah, maybe I can picture myself at the University of California. So I think we've got to do everything we can to get in front of those students early. And that's the last thing I'll end on, is that we often interact in admission offices with students in their junior, senior year, but I can't emphasize how important it is to get in front of students early on, even late middle school, to help them make good choices early on in high school, to put them in a position to be a competitive applicant at many of our campuses. Because we want to talk about beyond eligibility. Eligibility is great, but that's the foundation. We want students to really achieve well beyond that. And that means we got to get in front of them early to help encourage them to reach those goals.
Thank you, Gary. And yes, the university has programs up and down the state in local high schools and middle schools to help students prepare for not just UC, but for any selective college or university. I'm going to take a question from the chat, and I'm going to open it to any of our panelists. And it has to do with grade inflation, right? So how will we determine if grade inflation is more rampant now that the SAT or ACT is out? How are we thinking about grade inflation and its impact on our review? And I'll open that to anyone who wants to take that one.
I'll take an initial stab, and then Hanmi and Madeline can certainly jump in. Grade inflation is not new. This is something that I think has existed for some time, and there's plenty of national data that shows the trends of GPAs increasing over the years. I think the way that we've always tried to address that is going back to a word that Madeline emphasized earlier, and that is context. When we're evaluating a student's academic performance, we're doing so within the context of their school. And that allows us to really account for the available curriculum, the number of honors AP, IB courses that might be available to the student, and what really constitutes a strong academic performance in that setting. Because, if you have a school that offers a slew of APs, a student may have a well above a 4.0 weighted GPA, but you may have a student at another school that doesn't offer those kinds of courses where you're not going to see anything above a 4.0. So you have to look at those applicants each in the appropriate context to evaluate, their performance in terms of the curriculum available to them in their school. And I think the idea of really kind of being laser focused on that now, I think is complicated by COVID and by the fact that we're going to have several cycles of students going through the admission process that are going to have a blip in their high school program, where we're going to see a much larger number of perhaps pass grades versus traditional letter grades, either at the choice of the student or the choice of a school or a teacher, that made that decision for them. So that's going to have an impact on the UC GPA that we see for students coming into UC for the next couple of years. So I think we really have to look at the long game here as it relates to assessing grade inflation and not be too laser focused in this period, because there are some other things that are really going to conflate what that data looks like, not just the change in testing policy.
So staying in this this theme about how students are going to fare at the university, given all the things we've talked about, inflated grades, absence of testing. For Madeline, how are the faculty thinking about assessment of how students are faring at UC, and what factors will now be critical to student success in a test-free environment?
Yeah, I mean, it's such a complicated question. Again, kind of referring to what Gary said about teasing out the impact of COVID in the midst of all this, right? Because we know also that students have been differentially impacted, right? And so, the kind of support that students need, we've never done this before either, right? So, I mean, we really need to learn and be responsive to different kinds of issues and support and so on that students bring to us over the next few years. So kind of assessing student success is going to be a little bit complicated for the at least foreseeable future, and hopefully that's it. Like we'll get past this and we'll go back to normal, quote unquote normal. But I do think thinking about understanding how students are faring at UC, students who might not have applied and been admitted with standardized tests. So students who, So in this new situation, I think some of the same metrics that we use will still be relevant, like first year GPA and time to degree and so on. But I'm going to echo Gary again in thinking about other kinds of metrics that show the extent to which students are really finding themselves at home and finding themselves, kind of fitting in and being part of a community at our campuses. I think things like, from a faculty perspective, research, the extent to which students get involved in different research opportunities that they're offered on our campuses, whether that's helping a professor with research or pursuing their own research through independent studies or through honors programs. Those kinds of things that show that students are really engaged in their own learning and engaged in their education. I think that's really important. And also, again, as Gary mentioned, kind of community involvement, civic involvement, the extent to which students are kind of finding groups on campus that speak to them and that are meaningful to them. Those kinds of metrics are, of course, not, they're hard to quantify, but they're really important in letting us know how students are doing and how they're kind of, again, finding themselves at home in the campus that they've enrolled in. So I think that's really important. And I also think faculty engagement is really important. I think my experience, at least, during COVID, faculty have kind of stepped up their game in terms of being aware of, resources that are available to help students if they're struggling. And I think we just need to continue with that and be engaged with students, be attentive to, ways that we can help and just kind of have an understanding of what's available, again, to students on campus. And then also really just kind of listening to students, asking them, through the surveys that we do with students each year, and trying to understand obstacles that they're facing. And maybe, again, once we're past COVID, kind of seeing if there are any changes or anything that we should be particularly aware of now in this test-free admissions environment that we didn't see before. So I think it's just a matter of kind of really being attentive to what our students are telling us, and then again making sure that they're taking advantage of the resources available to them on campus. I think that's really important.
Thank you. And I do want to encourage you, if you have questions, we're getting some really good ones in the chat. So feel free to ask your question there, and we'll do our best to get to it. So I'm going to open this up to the group and ask each of you to think about it and respond. Why go through all this trouble? Why not just have a lottery for any student who's cleared a GPA threshold? Or not? Go ahead, Hanmi.
Yeah, I think, for a campus, especially campuses like UCLA, where they have so many applicants, it certainly would be simpler and take a fewer resources. But, as I stated, our guiding principle for underlying comprehensive review is to really look at each individual and their achievements, the personal and educational achievements in the context of what was available to them. And so to do a lottery really ignores and would be a disservice to students who challenge themselves every day despite, their circumstances. And I know that last month in November, there was a study that was published. The authors, I think, Baker and Bastido out of SMU and Michigan. They looked at multiple lottery simulations. And for selective admissions in particular, they concluded that it would actually have pretty negative outcomes on diversity. And that's like the last thing that we want at the University of California. We really want to give everybody a fair shot. And I know that, some folks think that lottery is the fairest way. And yet we believe that to really give everyone a view of equity is to look at individual circumstances and be able to look at the individual applicants and give them an individualized review.
Do anyone else want to take a stab at a response to that one?
Yeah, I mean, I would echo a lot of what Hanmi said. I mean, I think we are charged by the faculty to bring in a class each year, not just of eligible students, but we're given all these tools and comprehensive review to really shape the class, to really shape the students that are coming into our institutions each year. And, I represent a campus that we are incredibly fortunate that the quality of students that are applying to our institution is such that we could fill 2 or 3 freshman classes and have little to no drop off, and some of the statistical measures of quality associated with, with our students. But within those numbers, which is often what these things get boiled down to, there's a lot of qualitative data that is rich and allows us to really understand who these students are and what they bring to the campus community above and beyond just how they might have performed in a classroom. So the idea of kind of seeding that to a lottery, doesn't feel like we're really bringing in the class that our faculty would be exciting to teach. It's excited to teach. It's really just more, here's a group of eligible students, that were randomly selected. That doesn't feel like what we're charged to do as admission offices. And I think that comprehensive nature of those elements of comprehensive review, I think are wise in their consideration of a variety of things, circumstances, abilities, both in and outside of the classroom, that I think really leads to the extraordinary student bodies that each of these campuses enroll each year.
Thank you. Madeline, anything you'd like to add?
No, I would just echo what Gary and Hanmi have said so eloquently. And, again, the 13 factors for comprehensive review, they really do allow students to shine in different areas, right? And so we want that. I mean, we want students who are, who have a range of skills and interests and experiences and successes and so on. And so just a lottery just based on GPA would really, would not be nearly as effective, I think, in enabling us to really see students at their very best.
Thank you. So, Hanmi, I'm going to ask you the next question. It's about outcomes. We've been through one admission cycle that was test-free, and we're, embarking on the next one. What have been some of the outcomes that you've seen as a result? And then I have a follow-up for you more specifically about yield. But what are some of the outcomes?
So for last year, our first year in utilizing test-free admissions for fall 21, our applications increased system-wide by 13%. And so it's a tremendous increase seen across the board by all of our campuses, which in a way was surprising because we were still in the middle of a pandemic, right? And so it was something that the campus had to adapt to. The increase in volume, I think, was a little more than unexpected. We anticipated the increase in volume based on some of the other institutions that had gone test optional in the past. It's usually followed by an increase in applications, but this was just beyond, I think, any of our expectations. But I also think that, as Gary had mentioned earlier, that it suggests that, there are strong students in the pipeline who, for whatever reason, may have been deterred by from applying in the past, or maybe have been advised against applying, maybe based on sort of our average test score profiles of our applicants that admit, because we used to put that information out sort of to guide and help students. But I think maybe that had been a disservice, or some students took that to mean they would not have a chance at admission. And so it's been positive in that it's opened the door to many, many more students. Applications in particular from African American and Chicano Latinos in California increased by 22% and 12% respectively. And then in terms of the admitted class, we admitted a record number of freshmen from California, and 43% of them were from underrepresented groups, the highest percentage in total number, and in the highest the percentage in the history of UC, and also as a total number of students, which was like more than 36,000 students from underrepresented groups admitted to the system. And we were able to stay on pace with our first generation college students. At 45% of the admitted class were first generation, and 45% also from low income backgrounds, which was also similar to the previous year, fall 2020. Yield was tricky. I did not envy the campuses, because the one thing that, standardized tests did for campuses was really help them model yield, in that, test scores could help campuses know sort of what other institutions a student might be applying to, who their competitors were, and predict, what other types of admission offers the students would get, and do some modeling about, how the students would act in terms of which admission offers would they end up taking. And so, this was a really difficult year for campuses in knowing how they were going to yield. And but our campuses, were, I think, all very successful in yield. And there was if I can go to a question, I think that was in the chat, there's a question about, was there a difference between the holistic admit pool and the test score admit pool? There is no such distinction. We don't have those kinds of pools, unless I'm not misunderstanding the question, in that, our applicant pool is admitted all based on the comprehensive review. Some campuses have a holistic process in reading process, and other campuses use a slightly different way of implementing comprehensive review, but there's no automatic admit pool previously based on test scores. So I think the yield was, again, it would be difficult to tease out the factors of yield based on the changes to the test policy versus also just what was happening again in the middle of the pandemic, and whether or not, where students were choosing to go to college based on economics or proximity to their house, and other factors that, were reduced, not just because of, where they applied and where they were admitted.
These are unusual years, and we'll, all of our data for a long time going forward will have those asterisks. Let me ask about international or out-of-state applicants. How does this change affect them? And I'll hand that to Hami.
Yeah, so the policy applies to all applicants, regardless of their residency. And the comprehensive review factors are applicable to all applicants as well, so regardless of residency. It doesn't change the fact that a lot of international students may be on a different grading scale, or their in the curriculum, it may be different than what we see in California, but we've been, dealing with that for decades, so there's no change.
Great, thank you. So Gary, let's talk about the people who actually are right in the middle of this process, the admissions readers. They're such a crucial part of the review process. And what are you doing to help them fulfill their responsibilities in these new test-free environments? And are there any additional considerations for readers in a test-free environment that you'd like to share?
Sure. So there are a couple of things I can mention there. First, I will say this is an area where, for a number of reasons, but being test-free is much easier than being test optional, because when it comes to training readers, there's a whole other level of training that enters into a discussion where some students will have scores and some students won't. How do you consider those scores? Thinking about access to counseling, especially in California, which is one of the worst in the country in terms of counselor to student ratio. What kind of advice would students be getting in that situation as to, okay, I took the SAT and I got this score, should I submit it or not? I think test optional forces the hand of the student to make that decision, some of whom have great support in making that call, others don't. So being test free just wipes that slate clean, and it allows us to train our readers in a way that, look, that 14th criteria is gone. It is no more. It has ceased to be. So we are now focusing on these other 13 elements of comprehensive review and training in much the same way that we had in the past about how to consider all of those in a comprehensive way and in the total consideration of the student's application. I think where we have continued to build on previous training that we've done with our readers is to really step up our efforts around kind of anti-bias training and to ensure that readers understand that coming into any review process, we all have implicit biases that we have to understand that they exist and actively account for those in the review of an application to ensure that they don't enter into the review process. I think that's always been important. But I think with the removal of standardized testing, we really felt like it was a good time to really step that up and ensure that we're going really well above and beyond to ensure that all of our readers, that anybody involved in the review of applications at our campuses has participated in that kind of anti-bias training to ensure that they understand how to account for that. And that they understand more broadly outside of just anti-bias, the rules of engagement for the University of California. The amount of time we commit to training readers each year is extraordinary. It is a process that starts in October for many campuses and leads up to the point of starting to review applications. So it's something that I think has always been critical, but with the removal of standardized test scores, I think really became even more important to ensure that we were really attending to things like anti-bias and adherence to policy with the removal of those testing scores.
Great, thank you. There's a question in the chat about our major outreach programs and how they aim to assist students. So the university is in addition to efforts that are local on every campus, has a number of system-wide programs that are located on each of our campuses. Our major programs are our early academic outreach program, which works with students beginning in middle school, especially around key aspects for selection, like the rigor of A through G courses, and academic preparation for the university. Our MESA program, Mathematics, Engineering, Science Achievement, which we administer in partnership with the other segments, which focuses on science, technology, math in the provision of services, and our Puente project, which uses literacy as a basis for academic preparation. We also have programs in the elementary schools. We have partnership centers with all of our on all of our campuses. We evaluate transcripts for A through G so that students and schools understand where individual students stand and where schools can make changes in their portfolio of A through G classes so that more students have access. And we also have near-peer programs that place recent graduates into local high schools to provide advising and to be mentored by professional counselors. So a big effort throughout the state that reaches more than 250,000 students every year, in addition to work that the campuses do. And we do find that early and frequent engagement with the university pays off in yield. So we will see that those students are more likely if admitted to the university to take a university offer. We have time for one more question, and I'm going to ask this of everyone. And it's, to what degree would high levels of skill and knowledge in certain disciplines influence admission?
I think the classic answer is it depends.
Exactly.
Right, Gary? It depends on what else is there. I mean, it's never a one size fits all. And, when we talk about these 13 comprehensive review factors, we don't expect a student to be checking off every box. I have this, it's really, what do they bring to the table? What do they have with them at their own table? And then, presenting that in our application. So it really depends.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the beauty of it, is that there are some students that will excel in exactly that way. They will show some particular talent or skill in music or in some other subject that they have a real interest and talent in, and will demonstrate that in the process. And that might be something that aids in their admission decision. But other students might present strengths in other ways that they may not have that dedicated focus on an academic area of study quite yet at 16 or 17 years old. They're still finding that way and finding that interest, and will develop that focus when they get onto one of our campuses. But I think that's the benefit of comprehensive review, is it really gives students opportunities to shine in a number of different ways.
Thank you. Madeline, anything you'd like to add?
I'm just trying to pull up the 13 factors for comprehensive review as folks were speaking, to note that they're phrased in such a way that it kind of admits different options, different possibilities for strong areas that students have. So special talents, special projects, participation in educational preparation programs. So that there's kind of beauty in that breadth, because it really does allow students to allow us to see different students with different kinds of strengths, and allow students to really put their not their best foot forward, their actual skills and interests and aptitudes and kind of put that into their application package, so that we can see them in the best light.
Any last words from our panelists? Anything you want to make sure that people who have been listening walk away with around this new approach to UC admissions? And I'll start with Gary.
Yeah, I mean, I think the positives, far outweigh the negatives, and it's early. This class just enrolled, but I think that as we've talked about this today, I think you can hear that we really feel like this has widened the door a bit. And there are more students now that can see themselves at UC. I think that's a positive. I think the impact on the volume of applications can be challenging. Happy to see all these students applying, but we're going to read them all twice, and so there's a workload associated with that. But I think this is something that I'm happy to see UC leading on discussion around standardized testing. So I think we're in an exciting time.
Thank you. Hanmi.
You caught me off guard. Sorry.
Oh, sorry.
I can go and give me a few minutes to.
Sure, that would be fine, Madeline.
Yeah, I would just emphasize what I said, I think, in my answer to the very first question, which is the faculty involvement and the kind of expertise that faculty have brought to this decision. I think it's really important to note that, that it was data-driven, evidence-based, and something that I feel faculty are, by and large, behind, and so I think that's important.
Hanmi, you get the last word.
I just want to remind folks that I'm going to take the words of one of my campus colleagues, where he always says, we're not looking for perfection, we're just looking for excellence, and every student has the opportunity to be excellent in their own way. And so, I'm really proud of what the University of California has done to lead the way towards on the standardized test issue. It's actually or kind of a fun fact, I think, for me is December is when I first started working at the Office of the President 21 years ago, actually. And one of my first assignment was to, respond to President Atkinson at the time and his call for, eliminating use of standardized tests in admissions. And now here we are doing exactly that. So.
Yvette, may I speak?
Yes, Meg, please go ahead, Margaret.
Hi, this is Margaret Heisel. I just want to thank our panel, you and the rest of our panelists so much. And I also think, I began it and I'd like to close this session. And what I want to say is you have provided really substantive information. And I think we should run this again in about a year in order to get additional information and to learn more both about outreach, how we are reaching out to schools and students, and what the results of our new policy are. I hope we can do this. But thank you, Madeline. Thank you, Gary. Thank you, Hanmi. And very much thank you, Yvette.
Thank you all for the opportunity. We really appreciate it. And we'll say goodbye to everyone until next time. Thank you so much.
Thank you.